Happy Sunday, BookTube. It is snowing outside. I am cold. It is not a haiku. I'm also very worn out and sleep deprived. I have not been sleeping well pretty much at all for like the last 2 weeks or so. So this could get a little entertainingly loopy, but I'm trying to keep making content for the channel. And today, when I'm filming this video anyway, it is Super Bowl Sunday, so football fans, happy Super Bowl Sunday. And I have football videos to talk about, or football books to talk about today. I'm kind of wrapping up the whole discussion I've been doing with the CTE topic. After these 2 books I'm going to talk about today, I don't have any more CTE books planned. I didn't plan to do as many videos as I've done so far on them. It just kind of spiraled out that way. It's like I found one book and then other books kept coming. So it just so happened that after I did the League of Denial and Concussion and after the cheering stops and all of that, what is it? Zondervan. I forgot the publishing. Zondervan contacted me and offered me the chance to review Truth Doesn't Have a Side, which is the actual memoir by Bennet Omalu. And I was curious about this because I remember when I was reading League of Denial and Concussion by G. Mariaskis, I was wondering what it would be like from his perspective directly. There is like a piece of fuzz or something on my hat that's there. I think I got it. It was like in my peripheral that was driving me crazy. I was wondering what the story would be like directly from his perspective. There were portions of Concussion, the book Concussion, that were written by him, but I remember when I was reading that book, I was like, kind of cool to have like a whole book by him. And so here we are. So I know this looks like a lot of tabs in here, but they're just like little portions that I wanted to share that hopefully won't take a long time. With Concussion, it focused more on his actual CTE work, or at least that was the idea. I think when I read that book, it was like the first part of that book was like that, but then it started to veer off more into his personal life. But it wasn't a super long book, so you didn't really get that much information. This actually doesn't focus that much on the CTE topic. Kitty. I have a mirror on the back of my door, my bedroom door, and the cat has discovered it recently, and he's discovered the whole seeing his reflection in the mirror. He doesn't know what to do with that. Hold on, he's gonna keep doing that. I think if you're looking specifically for the CTE information, I still say League of Denial is the most comprehensive book I've read to date on that topic. And even Omalu references that book a lot in this book. This I was interested in because he does talk about the CTE case and Mike Webster and all of that, but it's a very small portion. I forget the exact page count, but I think it's like 130 pages or so, maybe a little more, into this book. It's only like 300 something pages to begin with, the whole thing. Yeah, it takes almost half the book for him to get into that, really. The primary focus of this book is his actual life, his life journey from growing up in Nigeria during the Nigerian Civil War. He was actually born during the Nigerian Civil War, and he talks about the struggles his parents went through, and talks about how he wanted to become an airline pilot originally, but his parents were really set on him studying medicine, so he did that for them. And he fully admits that it was not a calling for him, but he figured once he was there, might as well make the most of it and truly dedicate himself to it, which thankfully he did, because look at all this science we've discovered through him now. The thing that I think is most interesting to take away from this is his personal journey with coming to America as an immigrant. And he came here in 1994, and the thing I think is crazy and powerful and need to know kind of information is he comes here in 1994 with this vision of America being this land of opportunity, the whole milk and honey immigrant idea. And he just thinks that it's this, I think in the book he says in his mind it was the closest to like a biblical Eden that he could think of anywhere in the world. And he comes over here, and I think the first place he lands is Seattle. He's known for, being the medical examiner in Pittsburgh, but he had a whole life before that in Seattle where he basically had to re-obtain his medical degree. He had one from Nigeria, but for some reason it didn't transfer over quite right here, and he basically had to get a whole new one here. So that's part of why when you see the movie Concussion, there's a scene at the beginning where they have him go through like all the different certifications and degrees he has. He said that was kind of the start of it, is he just started going to classes for things and trying different programs, and he just ended up with this laundry list of things he was qualified to do all of a sudden. But he talks about coming to the Seattle area, and he starts college here, or not here, but in Seattle, and he's surprised because the school he's going to, it's in a predominantly white area. He's coming from an area that got out of a civil war not that long ago, so he's thinking it can't be worse than that. That was horrific. Comes over here and people are horrible to him. Remember, I said this was in 1994, not like 1957. He comes over here and he has to deal with, he talks about going to the grocery store and being basically stalked and followed at the grocery store. He walks down the street and people go to the other side of the street, and he says he's harassed multiple times by the same cop who stops him at night, walking from classes to the dorm room. The same cop will stop him and say, "Hey, what are you doing out here?" And he's like, "You've literally had this conversation with me at least half a dozen times just this week." And the cop is always like, "Well, don't start any trouble," kind of thing. And that's just like minor stuff he goes through. And then he has to deal with racial slurs in the hallways, not only from white students, but other black students, which he was surprised by. And he goes to class and he's trying to learn and trying to obtain his education. And he goes to these courses where there's a lot of class discussion, and the professors never let him speak. He tries to get in on the discussion. They never call on him. Whenever he tries to speak, they try to cut him off. Just all of these moments of racism that it blindsided him, because he's like, this is America. It's horrible to think that, I mean, I'm not naive enough to think that racism has been eradicated. No, how can we still have these things? Like, I know there's going to be racists around forever. You're never going to completely eradicate them. But the fact that he's going through these things that you hear about our parents and our grandparents witnessing, he's still going through them in the 1990s, where everybody was supposed to start being a little bit more open-minded about things. And that's just like minor stuff he goes through. He talks about how when he goes to Pittsburgh and he takes up a medical examiner job, he still gets hate mail on his desk, and his family is threatened, and just like horrific things. When he tries to go through trying to obtain his work visa so he can work in this country, he tries to follow everything by the letter. Because he explains how there's this whole long process about how he was trying to get citizenship, or not citizenship, he wasn't applying for citizenship yet. He was trying to just hold on to his work visa while he was here. He explains all this, why he was doing that rather than citizenship. But basically there was something where in order to keep the American work visa, he had to go to an office in Mexico and sit through an interview there. It was very bizarre. But he tried to do everything they wanted to do, and all these people kept coming in and basically finding ways to roadblock his progress, either with the visa or with school. And it's just, when you're reading this, you're like, God, it seems like an act of God that he got a medical degree here at all. I think just from that aspect, this book is really important to read. Speaking of sort of idea with racism and what is the term I'm trying to think? I'm sorry, as I'm working through like fatigue fog here. The sort of like mass thinking kind of destructive thinking that happens with racism, where you plant a seed in a generation and it just starts developing. And he talks about that, and then he also brings up this term that I'd never heard of before, but once he mentioned it, I was like, that is perfect. He talks about what he calls conformational intelligence. And he says, I define conformational intelligence as a phenomenon whereby the way you think and perceive the world, including your sense of right and wrong and good and evil, are controlled, constrained, and constricted by the expectations, cultures, traditions, norms, and more of the society around you, without you even knowing it or being aware of it. As a result, when objective factual evidence is presented to you that runs counter to the conformational cast of your mind, you deny and reject that evidence, even though it is true and your preconceived notions are false. And it's like that applies to so many things, even in today's world, that people are presented with factual information that tells them your previous thinking is wrong and it's outdated and it's naive and it's hurtful. And people will still live by it because that's just what they know and they don't need to know any better. And I never heard the term conformational intelligence before, but I was like, yes, there's a term for it. Some of the stuff he gets into with the CTE stuff. It was interesting that he mentions that all of this focus is put on the Mike Webster case, and he's like, that's not even actually the first case I worked on for this study. I mean, I guess I'm saying that wrong. Mike Webster was the first one that had him thinking about the tau proteins and all of that, but he cites an earlier case he was working on that kind of got the wheels turning, where maybe he didn't realize it was connected at the time, but then he thought back to this case and he was like, oh, I've actually been studying this for a while. So he mentions Mike's was not even the first brain on which I conducted such a thorough analysis. Not long before Mike came into my autopsy suite, I conducted an autopsy on a woman named Florence. She lived in an abusive relationship with her husband. One night he beat her up and pushed her down a flight of stairs. She suffered severe traumatic brain injury with subdural hemorrhages. The fall did not take her life, not immediately at least. She lived in a vegetative state and passed 4 years later. I ordered the same types of tests on Florence's brain that I did on Mike's. In addition to the signs of the major trauma she suffered, I also found major changes in her brain that resembled Alzheimer's disease, albeit with some slight differences. I paid for the analysis of Florence's brain out of my own pocket. I had to find answers for Florence just as I did for Mike. So that's one thing he does discuss in this book, that people come up to him sometimes and say, oh, what made you such an advocate for this subject? Or, why is this such a cause for you? And he's quick to say that it didn't start out to be a cause for him. It's just, he takes personal pride in his work, and he takes each case he gets as an individual. He said, just because they don't have a pulse, there's still a person there, and I feel compelled and obligated to finish out their story and find the answers for them. So he takes it on a person by person basis. So he did it for Florence, he did it for Mike, and it just so happened that with Mike, because of his fame and notoriety, it just sort of spiraled out into this thing. And because it involved such a big corporation as the NFL, everybody wanted to know what he was finding out. And even with Mike Webster's case, he mentions that he still wasn't trying to make a cause out of it. It was just he wanted to be thorough with his job. The only reason he ended up making it a cause, like people like to think of it as, is because of the paper he published, or the multiple papers. I think there were like 3 or 4 in total, where he the papers that he co-authored with the other doctors that first brought up CTE and tau proteins and all of that. And the NFL shot back with their doctors and told him they wanted it retracted as false medicine, false information. He said once the NFL came back and told him that they required him to retract that, or they demanded it, he realized what he was up against, and he started thinking about all the families that are tied to the patients he worked on, or the cases he worked on. He said, all of those brains I studied, those were all men who had families attached to them. And the families want answers. The families deserve answers. And when the NFL tried to block him from that, he said that's when he decided it needed to be a cause, because that wasn't fair to them. Speaking about those papers, I'm trying to do this so it makes sense in my brain. Do it somewhat chronologically. So he's talking about making the papers, writing up those papers with the other doctors, and he's talking about, okay, we have this thing that I've found on these slides. We need to call it something that will make sense, that will stick in brains of people that are studying this, that's not too complicated, not too hard to say. Although encephalopathy does take a little bit of practice to get your tongue around. But he explains, okay, I need to give it a name, I thought to myself, but what? I spent the next 2 weeks contemplating that question. In my mind, the name had to meet 4 criteria. First, it had to be intellectually sophisticated. Second, it needed to have a good acronym, which would help it stick and make it more likely to permeate society. Third, the name also had to be generic enough to give me some wiggle room if my concepts were proven wrong, and yet specific enough to actually describe the disease I've had observed. So finally, I recognized that this was ultimately an occupational disease. And being an occupational disease, it was only a matter of time before it ended up in a court of law. As such, it fulfilled what is known in the American legal system as the Doe-Bear Standard. The Doe-Bear Standard states that for scientific evidence to be admissible in court, it must be a generally accepted principle and must have precedent. Therefore, I could not use any novel name I wanted to, like dementia footballitica, because such a phrase would never be used in medical literature. My search for a name took me back to my original research. Going back to the time of Hippocrates, I identified 37 descriptive terminologies that had been used to describe symptoms of permanent brain damage following blunt force head trauma. As I went through the list, 2 terminologies stood out above the others: chronic traumatic encephalopathy and chronic traumatic brain injury. I quickly settled upon chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. Chronic means long-term, traumatic means associated with trauma, and encephalopathy means a bad brain. So in other words, the terminology referred to a bad brain associated with trauma over a long period of time. That's exactly what I had observed in Mike Webster's brain, so now I had my name. I chose chronic traumatic encephalopathy to fulfill the purposes I had laid out for my criteria in finding a name. I believe my efforts were very successful. 15 years ago, no one had even heard of CTE. Today, nearly everyone who watches or participates in football is aware of it, even down to little children in my son's kindergarten class. When I walk in the door of his classroom with him, other students will ask me, "Are you the CTE doctor?" I believe that if I had used a totally novel name that had never been used in medical literature, it would have made it easier for sports leagues to reject or deny CTE in the court of law based on the Doe-Bear Standard. He goes on to say that when he published these papers that became so infamous with this subject, and the NFL came back, they came back with their doctors and published multiple papers of their own through their own doctors, arguing his ideas, rejecting his ideas, saying why they argued with them. He said, I think it was in 2005, he said, they even came out with one paper that said it was actually safer to keep players in the game and have them play through a concussion than it was to take them out and let them heal. He also mentions there was another paper they came out with that it was supposed to be a rebuttal to one of the papers he published. And he said when he read it, he realized their argument was basically corroborating what he was saying in his paper. So he was like, "Do you even read my paper? So basically we're in agreement then." And they're like, "Wait, what? No, what? Hold on." The back and forth he talks about is pretty funny until it gets not funny and it starts, messing with his job and his home life and stuff. But the initial phase. Speaking of doing justice to the families, a couple of the things he mentions in here is he goes to see the niece of Andre Waters, who was one of the victims of CTE. It was confirmed after his death that it was found in his brain. He goes to see Andre Waters' niece, and when he comes back from the meeting, he says he's basically sitting in his car upset at everything they had talked about. And he says, her stories shook me and left me grieving for what the game of football took from him. When I left the next day for the long drive back to the airport, her stories kept running through my mind. At one point, I had to pull over because my tears were clouding my vision. The thought of Andre Waters and who knows how many other players suffering in obscurity in total silence broke my heart. When they played and gave everything they had on the field, crowds cheered and people treated them like royalty. Fans in the stands wore jerseys with the players' names scrawled across the back. But once they were too broken down to play, they were dropped like sacrificial lambs. The fans would move on to the latest set of players. When stories like Andre Waters' suicide made the news, the fans stopped for a moment and uttered things like, "What a waste," and he had so much going for him. And then they went right back to cheering for their team, oblivious to what their favorite sports had done to their heroes. That's what made me so angry and upset. Once the great heroes could no longer perform, they were just forgotten. That's what he mentions about Andre, and then he also talks about how he worked on the case of Junior Seau, who was another victim of CTE. It was also found in his brain. Omalu actually spoke with Junior Seau's son the night before he was set to perform the autopsy, and he basically confirmed with the son. He's like, "Are you sure you are okay with me doing this?" And the guy's like, "Yeah, no, I want to know what happened to my dad." So he said, "Okay," and he figured he had the go-ahead. When Junior Seau, yet another great retired NFL player, committed suicide in 2012, I was invited to assist with the autopsy. I removed his brain and spinal cord from his body and processed, prepared, and packaged them for analysis and transport with me on the plane. As I was about to leave for the airport, Junior Seau's son called the medical examiner's office and called me all types of names no man deserves to be called. He said I shouldn't get anywhere near his father's body. This was the same person who had given me verbal consent the previous night to examine his father's brain. Apparently, some people had misinformed him about Bennet Omalu and fed him lies. Junior Seau's brain was taken from me and sent to the NIH. I think that's National Institute of Health, I think is the acronym. NIH doctors analyzed the brain and sent histological sections of the brain across the country to a panel of neuropathologists who confirmed what I believed. Junior Seau had suffered from CTE. It should surprise no one that the NIH did not include me on the panel of neuropathologists who conducted the test. What did I do wrong? It's just something he continually asks in all these experiences he talks about in his life, is from, experiencing the war in Nigeria and coming here and fighting the racism and having the professional blocks whenever he tried to find something scientifically and then have somebody else try to cover it up. He just kept asking this question, what am I doing wrong? What did I do wrong? Why is everyone blocking me? One of the other things he goes over a little bit is, I thought this was interesting too, he mentions this myth that all football players make a ton of money and have access to all the greatest technology and medicine in the world and all that. He takes a moment in the book, said, I just thought I would clear that up real quick. He said, yes, there are a lot of players that get into football because it is better from where a lot of them are coming from. A lot of them do work really hard and apply themselves to sports, try to get into the NFL, because if they get in the NFL, they can help their family out of poor communities. That is a thing. But he says, he's using the example of Andre Waters, saying that that was one example of someone trying to get into the NFL to try to help his family get out of poverty. It says, it seemed their family history had been transformed from its roots in slavery to laying hold of the American dream. This is one of the greatest fallacies of professional football. Fans believe the players all become fabulously wealthy and leave the game set for life. In truth, the median NFL player's salary is less than $1 million a year. While that seems like a lot, keep in mind that out of their salary, they must pay their agents a percentage, while their union fees take another cut. Then they have to pay taxes. After deducting all the taxes and fees, the player is left with something close to about $300,000. The average NFL career is 3.5 years, and most players are out of the game by their 30th birthday. That means the average NFL player earns about $1 million in take-home pay over his entire career in the NFL. And what did they have to give up for that payday? Emerging studies are suggesting that more than 90% of the brains of football players show CTE changes when they die. In one such study of 35 professional football players, only one, a 26-year-old man, did not show any CTE change. Personally, I have yet to examine a brain of a professional football player who did not have CTE. He goes on to say, NFL players put themselves at risk even though they are among the lowest paid professional athletes in comparison to the other major sports. The average Major League Baseball salary is $4 million. The average National Basketball Association salary is just under $6 million. The average salary in the National Hockey League, the least popular of the four major American sports, tops the National Football League average. Of those four, only football and hockey are high impact, high contact sports with a high risk of brain trauma. One of the other things I was glad he touched upon, because I was wondering about it myself. When I watched the movie, the documentary League of Denial that goes along with the book League of Denial, I watched it for free on YouTube. I don't know if it's still posted. I'll try to see if I can find a link for it. I think it was originally aired through like PBS or something. But I remember when I was watching that documentary, there was this woman doctor in the documentary that was saying basically that she was the one that was actually responsible for finding CTE, and I was just confused because I had just gotten done reading the League of Denial book and a number of articles that had mentioned Omalu, and then so I had his name in my mind, and then this woman pops up and said, well, it's actually me. And I was just like, what? I've never heard this woman come up in anything I've read so far. Who is this person? So he has a part in here. If you've watched that documentary and you've wondered about that yourself, there is something that addresses that, which I'm so glad, because I'm like, oh. But then when I found out what was behind it, it's actually kind of aggravating. So he says, my phone rang one evening. I recognized the number as an attorney friend of mine, an assistant district attorney. We didn't have any cases on which we were working together at the time, so I wondered why he might be calling me. When I answered, he was quite upset with me. Bennet, I thought you told me you discovered CTE. How could you lie to me? What are you talking about? How did I lie? I'm watching television right now, and there's a woman from Boston University on the screen who says she discovered CTE. Why would you tell me you discovered it if she did? I was so shocked I could hardly speak. Who is she? I asked. My friend told me her name. I'd never heard of her. And then he told me the names of a couple of other people in the same news report. I recognized their names as people who had at one time partnered with me, Bob Fitzsimmons, and Julian Bales to do research on the extent of CTE. Bob, Julian, and I had parted ways with them. They're lying, I told my friend. I briefly explained who these people were and how the break with them had come about. After hearing my story, my friend became even angrier, but not at me. He seethed. Oh my God, Bennet, you know what they're doing, don't you? Taking credit for my discovery. No, there's more to it than that. You may have not grown up in this country, but there is a historical precedent for what they are trying to do to you. They want to replace your black face with that of a blonde-headed white woman to whom they are more comfortable. How can this happen in America? I asked. I don't know, but it does. Things like this happen all the time. If there's money to be made, either through a product or through gaining research grants or marketing the results, there's a risk of this sort of theft of intellectual property. I believe that, like, finally an answer to that, because I'm like, who is this woman? Somebody had, well, I think he goes on to say, actually, I can just tell you. As sad and dark as my attorney friend's assertions may be, His assertions were confirmed several years later by the book and PBS documentary League of Denial. According to the book and documentary, the blonde white woman who claimed she discovered CTE was actually handpicked by Chris Nowinski and a man named Robert Stern from Boston University to examine the brains of football players after the Chris Benoit, sorry, I just took that out, Benoit case before the Tom McHale case. After my diagnosis of CTE and Tom McHale, a request was made by a family member for me to share the samples of the brain tissue with researchers at Boston University, and as a true scientist, I did. But this group at Boston University went public with the results without giving me any recognition or acknowledgement whatsoever. To them, I did not exist. Tom McHale was the first case of CTE in a football player announced by this group at Boston University. So they basically take his information, cut him from the record of discovering it, and then slap their name on it, and all these people get a happy white woman face to put on it. And it's just like yet another case of... And I remember reading this thinking like, I was angry for him. Because I don't get mentality like that. I honestly don't. I just want to be like, for fuck's sake, it's just skin color. Just skin color. I don't know. I was infuriated when I found out the story behind that. There's just so much information in here on his personal story. Like I said, the CTE thing, that comes a little bit later in the book if you want to know a little bit more of the backstory. It's already been covered for the most part in a lot of the other books I talked in the other videos, and he even admits that it's all pretty much out there now. But it is interesting to hear it from his side, and it is interesting to read the path from, you know, being a little boy and then growing up and the challenges he went through, and he gets into his battles with depression and trying to get through medical school when you have chronic clinical depression. I can't even imagine. I mean, I can imagine I have clinical depression, so I know that part, but like I'm saying, trying to get through medical school, knowing what I know that it does to you, I can't fathom that, but he did it somehow. So, you know, for that, he has my utmost respect, because that had to have been brutal. But he also talks about some behind-the-scenes stuff with the movie itself. I thought it was pretty cool that he said that he and Utecht had a little bit of a falling out. You know, Cyril Utecht, that was played by Albert Brooks in the movie. The real Cyril Utecht and him had a little bit of a falling out after the whole court case with Utecht and this whole NFL thing and everything. Basically, the NFL came after Utecht and tried to pressure him to throw Omalu under the bus, reputation-wise. And it caused a rift between them that lasted for years. But he does say that through the course of making the movie Concussion, they were actually able to repair their friendship and come back together a little bit, which I was happy to hear. Because I remember in the Concussion book by Laskis, he had talked about what a father figure that man was to him. So I was happy that I'm like, oh good, I like to read about reconciliations. And then he also mentions that the meeting with Will Smith. He said that when the studios approached him, they had a list of people. They were originally going to ask either Denzel Washington, Idris Elba, or Will Smith. And they battered about who was going to play him. The producers eventually decided they liked Will Smith the best as the option, but when they approached him, he originally wasn't interested. He's like, a kid plays football, I'm not really interested in doing a movie against football. But then once he got to meet Omalu and a friendship developed between them, he was actually like, no, I like where this is going. I think I can see your perspective. So he agrees to do it, and talks about how Will Smith actually sat in on autopsies that Omalu was doing to try to, I mean, it makes sense if he's going to play the guy, but I was just like, that is hardcore though, because if you think about like other things you have to do for movie training, a lot of it doesn't require having an actual dead body in front of you. I mean, it's like one thing if they put a prop, but no, he actually sat there with dead bodies and witnessed and like took in the smell of the morgue and chemicals and everything. I'm like, that is hardcore. But the movie came out great, so I guess he knew what he was doing. I just wanted to close this book on this prayer. It's this sort of like prayer, wish for the future kind of thing that Bennet closes his own book on, and I just thought I would share it because it just gave me a little heart fuzzy. So he says, "May we always have the grace and wisdom to know when we are called to stand by the truth, to fight battles in defense of the truth and light, no matter how insignificant or inconsequential we may think our lives are. God is the only truth and light, and the truth does not take sides. And in Him and by Him, all things are possible in our lives. The impossible becomes possible if we only believe. And let us act on our beliefs and act on the truth. Let us do the little good things in life, one person at a time, one act at a time, and to improve the lot of all our fellow human beings. Together, our small acts add up to become a force that improves the lot of us all and all mankind. We are all members of one another. What happens to the least of us happens to all of us." Which made me think of the Ubuntu thing that I mentioned in one of the, I forget what the name of it was. I think it was in the Motivational Mojito called Be the Change, when I talked about, I just blanked on his name. Damn fatigue in my brain. Desmond Tutu, Reverend Desmond Tutu. He talks about the African idea of Ubuntu, of like everything being interconnected, all of us being connected. That kind of made me think of that, and so I thought that would be a good place to close that one on. But I have one more book I wanted to talk about, which is one I just picked up recently. I found this not too long ago. I guess because I had been reading all these other CTE books, this one had come up in my suggested reading list, and I was like, yeah, what the hell. So that's Counting the Days While My Mind Slips Away by Ben Utecht, it is, or Utecht. He was a, he stopped playing for the NFL in 2009, but he was a tight end for the Indianapolis Colts, and then later the Cincinnati Bengals. And he got signed to the Colts right out of college, and in this book he talks about how exciting that is, because he was like a lot of boys. He grew up playing catch with his dad in the yard, and his dad took him to football games and training camps and all that kind of stuff. And he got a full ride scholarship to Minnesota, University of Minnesota. From there he played 4 years for them, and then from there he immediately got signed to the Colts. And he's just like, it's a dream come true. And he was pumped because he found out he got to play with Peyton Manning. And, you know, it's just every jock boy's dream. And he goes through his career of just taking these immense hits, though, because he talks about, you know, he's a big dude. I think he said he was 6'7" and 250 pounds. And he still takes a hit like anybody. And it's funny because like the focus is supposed to be on his head, but I kept getting distracted when he was talking about all the different skeletal injuries he was talking about. Like he mentioned like having like a shoulder dislocated, I think, and then a popped rib, and then his hips fractured, and then he had pelvic damage, and then he broke his ankle. And I'm just like, are you sure you don't have some sort of vitamin deficiency or skeletal disorder issue we need to look at? Because this is like, you're not talking about your head so much as like every other game you're getting something in your skeleton shattered. But I guess with all of along with that, he was also taking knocks to the head. And he said between his 4 years of college ball and his 6 years in the NFL combined, he had 5 documented major concussions on his file. And in here he goes on and on about how in so many of those it was basically like he was out for a little bit, and then he would come to, and then he would like shake it off and run back out on the field. a lot of the same of what they talked about in League of Denial, and also from League of Denial, he also talks about some of the drills he's put through, like I think it's called the bull in the ring drill, where there's like one guy in the middle and then the coach picks somebody to basically charge at you as hard as they can, and then they go back in the line and then somebody else does it, and he had to go through that over and over again. I think that's mentioned in League of Denial. And then he also, I think it was League of Denial, they also talked about the line of Toradol shots. He also talks about going through that. Speaking of painkillers, he says, looking back on my career from high school through college and the NFL, I cannot even begin to calculate the amount of pain and anti-inflammatory pills and shots I took. I don't think there was even 1 week where I didn't have to take something, even if it was small as an Advil. However, I never knew, and would not discover until after my career was over, that anti-inflammatories don't just help hurting joints feel better. They also mask the symptoms and consequences of concussions, including headaches incurred by hundreds of subconcussive hits that I took every year as a tight end, doing my best to block defensive ends and linebackers. So in the end, the drugs kept me on the field, and at the time, that's all that mattered. And that is an idea he reiterates a lot in this book, is that he had moments where he's like, this really hurts a lot, but, you know, I can still play. It's good. It's good. It was all about winning the game and getting the points and doing the sports thing. Yeah. Just turned into a total girl right there, but it's just that mentality of like, as long as the game is going on, as long as we're winning, as long as we're making progress, pain doesn't matter. But yeah, it turns out it does matter. He goes through and all these years of getting hit and having to take these pain numbers and things, he starts to notice towards the end of his career, I mean, at the time he didn't know it was coming to an end, but the last few years in there, he started noticing he was getting more and more fuzziness. He was having issues with trying to recall things. He was having problems with like night sweats and things like that. So he decides he's going to start using a journal to start documenting the different symptoms he notices day to day. And he does share some of those journal excerpts in here in the book, and I just thought I would share a couple just to give you an idea. A lot of them are around 2009 era when he's wrapping up his career unexpectedly. But like 8609, he says, strong headache, dizziness, sore neck, sleeplessness, night sweating, loss of balance, fatigue, blurry vision spots, nausea, hard time driving in car, forgetting sentences, hard to concentrate. And then another entry says 8909, random headaches, dizziness, sleeplessness, night sweating, loss of balance, fatigue, nausea, hard time driving in the car, forgetting sentences, hard to concentrate, irritability, sadness, snapping at wife. And he mentions that that's kind of what surprised him, is that was out of character for him. He wasn't one to rage normally. That sets him off on the course of trying to study brain trauma himself. And that's when he starts finding the information about Dr. Omalu, who, by the way, is blurbed on the back of this book. Dr. Omalu says, I strongly encourage every parent, child, and every person who plays or plans to play football or high-impact sports to read this book and become enlightened. But anyway, he starts finding out Bennet Omalu's work, and then he also starts reading the stories of people like Andre Waters and Junior Seau and the list of other guys that I'm having trouble recalling now. I think I listed them in the first video if you're interested in seeing the documented cases. He starts finding the cases of all those guys, and he basically has this moment of, oh shit, is that what I'm headed for? So he decides to become an advocate for brain health. He takes up public speaking. He speaks before Congress on the subject. He even is put on the board for the American Brain Foundation, and that becomes his work after the NFL. Because basically what happened with the NFL is he got injured so much that he basically lived on the injured roster list for the year of 2009 when he had moved from the Colts to the Bengals. And the Bengals had him for a while, and then he just gets word all of a sudden, hey, you've been cut. And he was like, I was under the impression that that was not actually allowed, that the rule is supposed to be that if you're on the injured roster list, they can't do anything. The rule is supposed to be that you have to be cleared for play before they can cut you. And it turns out, when he went to investigate what the hell happened, there was a doctor who apparently signed off on him being able to play, but then they found out that the doctor who signed off wasn't even a medical doctor. So there was something like hinky going on with the NFL. I'm not sure what was going on there, but it turned into this whole big court case with him, you know, having like basically the NFL being in breach of contract with him. He basically decides that he's pretty much done with the NFL now. Except for a couple seasons later, he decided that he was going to try one more time to try to get in one more season. And I think he goes and tries out for the Patriots, I believe. And unfortunately, he gets pushed aside for this little known rookie guy like Rob Gronkowski or something like that. I don't know. Hope something worked out with that guy. Just kidding. Yeah, speaking of Gronkowski, the whole thing ended up doing this circle of life thing, because what did I just see in the news just like 2 or 3 days ago? Yeah, and when I saw that, I was like, crap. I hope this is not another one on the list, because it's hard not to think about it once you start reading these books. Like, is he gonna, it's like, that was really quick. They cleared him for that. Is he gonna be okay? It's an interesting story. It wasn't quite as fascinating as, say, like Omalu's book or League of Now or anything, but it was interesting as far as like to get another perspective from sort of firsthand, somebody who's going through it. I mean, right now, I think they're trying to figure out the science to try to figure out CTE while a person is still alive, but according to Dr. Omalu, as of now, you still need to be dead for them to officially verify that it is CTE. This book is not so much about his head trauma per se. He explains that it was more like he was losing precious memories in his mind. He realized he was forgetting important things. Like he said, I went to a Super Bowl in 2006. The Colts won. I was there. I played with the Colts. I have pictures of me holding the Lombardi trophy. I have no memory of being there. It's like it never happened in my brain. He mentions one of his best friends talking about his wedding, the best friend's wedding, and he got mad at his friend because he's like, why didn't you invite me? I was supposed to be one of your closest friends. And his friend had to get out the photo album and say, you're here. You're in all of these photos. You are one of my groomsmen. And he, again, no memory of it. So he was worried he was going to start losing memories of his children and his wife. And so he said he wanted to put it down in a book, all the big monumental moments in his life, and have something that they could go to in case he gets to the point where he's not himself anymore and his brain fails him. He has something that they can go to remember him in a way. But he also wrote it for people that were just curious and wanted to know more on the subject of head trauma, for those people too. So it is interesting from that perspective. The writing itself is not like super riveting, but I thought there were a couple things in here I would share just from a funny point of view to kind of close this video on. There's one where they mention it was right after he got out of college. I think it was his first game with the Colts, I think. And he said, he talks about his dad being a pastor. And he said, after the Indianapolis Colts signed me to a free agent contract out of college, my dad went down to the local Irish sports bar and grill and made an arrangement with the owner. My son plays for the Colts, but the local stations don't show many of their games, so I was wondering, do you think you could use one of your televisions to show the Colts games while we watch? And the owner couldn't turn him down. Through my first year playing for the Colts, my dad and mom went straight from my dad's church to the Irish bar and grill every Sunday. When we played early games that started at noon Minnesota time, they sometimes missed the first quarter. And in my second year, my dad bought the NFL cable package so he could watch and DVR the Colts games at home. Probably looked a little bit better than a pastor going straight from church to the bar on a Sunday. Just cracked me up. And there are a couple funny stories in here involving Peyton Manning, and I just thought I would share one because when I read this, I kind of cracked up picturing this. And when they do the dialogue in here, I was actually like hearing Peyton's voice in my head because he, has a very distinct cadence to his voice. But it was when the Colts were going to the Super Bowl, and the coaches came and said, for the first time, we're allowing the wives to stay with you in the bedrooms at the hotel. And everybody was down for it except Peyton. He spoke up and said, I don't know if that's a great idea. And they're like, well, we'll talk about it later. It says, Peyton raised his hand and said, I think we should talk a little bit more about the wives staying with their husbands. We've never done that before any game, and I think we should discuss it a little bit more before we decide to do it. Okay, Peyton, we'll discuss it, Pauline said. Now, the next item we need to talk about, he said, and he kept going on. A few minutes later, Peyton spoke up again with something like, excuse me, Mr. Pauline? Yes, Peyton? I've decided that the wives are not going to be allowed to stay in with their husbands. We've come too far, and this game is too big for us to deviate from the way we've done things all season long. I think if we're honest with ourselves and we really look at the magnitude of this game and what it means for all of us, we will all agree that we need to continue doing our game preparation the same way we have all year long. So we are not going to have wives stay in the same room with their husbands. Funny thing is, no one disagreed with him. Some of the wives were not happy, but Peyton was right. We kept our normal game preparation and routine all the way down to room assignments. So I was picturing that when I first read that, I was like, who the hell are you to say? Because, that's like from a wife's point of view. If my husband was in a group and some other guy was going to say, no, you're not going to stay with your husband, my immediate reaction would be like, excuse me? But then thinking of it from a sports point of view, I got what he was saying, where he said, it's a big game. They worked really hard. If you change up your routine, you can psych yourself out, and then all that work goes to waste. So I was like, all right, he knows what he's talking about. But just like hearing his voice going, no, we're not going to have wives in the room. Like, whoa. So yeah, I just thought I would share those couple books to wrap up this whole CTE topic, because this is the wrap up of the football season for a while, and pretty soon baseball season is going to start, and I can finally get to that baseball video I was talking about doing last year and never got to. So thanks for watching this long ass video. Have a great Super Bowl, and we will talk soon. Bye guys.